Thank you for watching the video.
I knew from the very beginning that it was wrong. The second I let my guard down, the second I let my eyes linger too long, I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. But at the time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. It started with small things, a casual compliment that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The way his eyes held mine a little longer than they should have. The way he laughed at my jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. He made me feel younger, desirable, alive, and that was dangerous. I told myself I was imagining it, that he was just being polite, that I was reading too much into innocent gestures. But deep down, I knew better. And the moment he placed his hand on mine, just a brief touch, just long enough to send a spark through my body, I realized I wasn't the only one feeling it. He was my daughter's boyfriend, and I was playing with fire. I should have stopped it then. I should have walked away, reminded myself of everything that was at stake. But instead, I let it continue. I let the stolen glances turn into lingering touches, let the casual conversations turn into late-night messages. We were careful at first, cautious, but the tension built until it became unbearable. Until one night when we found ourselves alone and the last thread of self-control snapped.
By the way, if you're curious about what happened next, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Thank you.
I don't know what was worse, that I let it happen or that I wanted it to happen, that I didn't regret it the moment it was over. That when he kissed me, I didn't think about my daughter or my husband or the life I was risking. I only thought about him. Now, as I lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I know it's only a matter of time before this secret destroys everything. My daughter doesn't suspect a thing yet, but secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how hard you try to bury them. And when this one does, I'm not sure I'll be able to live with what I've done. Days passed, but the guilt didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier, settling in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. Every time I saw my daughter, I felt it tighten, a silent reminder of what I had done. She was happy, oblivious, completely unaware that the man she loved had already betrayed her in the worst possible way. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that it would never happen again, but lies, once started, have a way of multiplying. We told ourselves we could stop, that we had to stop, but the more we tried to stay away from each other, the more impossible it became. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. My husband hadn't looked at me like that in years. One evening, my daughter invited him over for dinner. I spent the entire night avoiding his gaze, hyper-aware of every movement, every shift in his expression, but he wasn't avoiding me. No, he was reckless. His eyes lingered, his touches on her were just a little too performative, as if he was overcompensating. My husband, of course, noticed nothing, but my daughter, she watched him carefully, her brow furrowing slightly, as if something felt off but she couldn't quite place it. And then came the moment that nearly undid me. As I cleared the dishes, I felt him behind me, close, too close. His breath was warm against my neck as he reached past me, his fingers just barely grazing my waist. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. My pulse raced, my hands trembled as I set a plate in the sink. When I turned around, he was already stepping back, his face carefully neutral. But I saw it in his eyes, the same dangerous thrill that had overtaken me that first night. I knew then that this wouldn't end until we were caught, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, and worst of all, a part of me wanted it too. The days that followed were unbearable. I couldn't escape the weight of what I had done, but even worse, I couldn't escape him. Every interaction was a test, every moment we spent in the same room a slow, dangerous game. My daughter was still oblivious, still smiling, still calling him the love of her life. And I was still pretending, still lying, still telling myself that I hadn't already destroyed everything she held dear. But he wasn't pretending. He had grown bolder, reckless even. His touches lingered longer, his eyes followed me when he thought no one was looking, and worst of all, he enjoyed it. The danger, the secrecy, the knowledge that I was just as trapped in this as he was. Then it happened. A weekend getaway. My daughter had planned it for the two of them, some romantic retreat outside the city. She was excited, telling me about it with the kind of love-drunk enthusiasm that made my stomach twist with guilt. But at the last minute, she had to stay behind because of work, sending him ahead on his own. And that was how I found myself driving out there alone under the excuse of dropping off something she had forgotten. I told myself it was innocent, that I wasn't going there for him, that I just wanted to clear my head to put distance between us. But that was a lie, just like every other lie I had told myself since this all began. When I arrived, he was waiting. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask why I had come. He just stood there, leaning against the doorway of the cabin, eyes dark, unreadable. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words. And then, without a single thought of what I was about to destroy, I stepped inside. I knew this was the moment that would change everything, that there would be no coming back from this, that the second I crossed this line, I would never be able to look my daughter in the eyes again. And yet, I did it anyway. The morning after, I woke up tangled in sheets that weren't mine, in a bed that didn't belong to me, next to a man I should have never touched. The weight of what I had done settled over me like a suffocating blanket. For a few blissful seconds before reality set in, I felt something close to peace. Then, as I turned my head and saw him lying beside me, eyes still closed, chest rising and falling steadily, the full force of my betrayal hit me like a brick wall. I slipped out of bed carefully, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The air was cold against my bare skin, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting out, leaving before I made this mistake even worse than it already was. But as I reached for my clothes, his voice stopped me. "You don't have to sneak out." I froze, my fingers gripping the fabric of my shirt. Slowly, I turned to face him. He was propped up on one elbow now, watching me with that same unreadable expression he always had. But there was something else there too, something smug, something victorious. Like he had won something I hadn't even realized I was playing for. "I have to go," I said, forcing the words out, trying to ignore the way my voice trembled. He sat up fully, running a hand through his tousled hair. "You always do." I didn't have time for games, not now. This was a mistake. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Was it, or was it exactly what you wanted?" I wanted to argue, to deny it, to insist that I hadn't meant for this to happen. But we both knew that was a lie, and I was so damn tired of lying. Instead of answering, I finished getting dressed, shoving my shoes on with shaking hands. I needed to leave, needed to get away from him, from this place, from the mess I had created. But as I reached the door, he spoke again. "She's going to find out, you know." My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head just enough to see him watching me, his gaze sharp, knowing. And what happens then? I didn't have an answer because I knew the truth. When my daughter found out, she wouldn't just hate him, she would hate me. The following days were unbearable. I tried to move through them as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I could still feel his hands on my skin, still hear his voice in my head, taunting me with the truth I refused to face. My daughter was oblivious, still texting him, still calling him with that sweet, excited voice that made my stomach twist in knots. She loved him, and I had betrayed her in the worst way possible. I wanted to believe I could bury it, that I could pretend this never happened, that I could force it into some dark corner of my mind and lock it away. But guilt doesn't work like that. It festers, it infects, it rots everything it touches. Then the moment I feared arrived. One evening, she came home earlier than expected. I was in the kitchen trying to act normal, trying to exist in the space of a mother who hadn't destroyed her own child's happiness. She was scrolling through her phone, a small frown on her face, and then she looked up at me. "Mom, did you see him today?" My stomach dropped. "What?" "He's been acting weird, distant. He barely texted me back, and when I asked him if everything was okay, he just said he was tired. Have you noticed anything?" I forced a smile, gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "No, honey, I'm sure he's just busy." She studied me for a second too long. "Are you sure?" I swallowed hard. "Of course." She hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, maybe I'm just overthinking it." I nodded, praying she would drop it, that she wouldn't push further, but I knew it was only a matter of time. She was smart, too smart, and secrets like this don't stay buried forever. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew what I had to do. I had to end it. Whatever sick, twisted thing had started between me and him, I had to kill it before it ruined everything. But I underestimated him. The next afternoon, as I left work, I found him waiting outside, leaning casually against his car, arms crossed, a slow, knowing smirk tugging at his lips. My pulse spiked. I glanced around, panic rising in my chest. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged. "Thought we should talk." "There's nothing to talk about. This was a mistake." His smirk didn't falter. "Was it? Then why do you look so nervous?" I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Because you showing up like this is reckless if she sees us." He tilted his head. "If she sees us, what exactly do you think is going to happen?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. But the way he looked at me in that moment sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't scared, he wasn't guilty, he was enjoying this. And that terrified me more than anything else. The next few days were a waking nightmare. I did everything I could to avoid him, ignored his texts, changed my schedule, even parked in a different lot at work. But he was always there, lurking in the background, reminding me that this wasn't over, that he wasn't going to let it be over. Then the worst happened. It was a quiet evening. My daughter and I were sitting in the living room, a movie playing on the screen, neither of us really watching. She had been distracted lately, distant, but I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that as long as she didn't know, everything would be fine. Then her phone buzzed, a message. She glanced at it and I saw the change immediately, the way her expression shifted, the way she suddenly stiffened. My stomach clenched. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer at first. She just stared at her phone, her fingers gripping it so tightly I thought she might crack the screen. Then, finally, she turned to me, her voice eerily calm. "Did you sleep with him?" The room tilted, the words didn't register at first. "What?" Her face twisted, something dark and broken flashing in her eyes. "Don't lie to me, did you?" My mouth went dry, my hands trembled in my lap. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was crazy, that she was being ridiculous. But I couldn't. She knew. Somehow, she knew. "Who told you that?" My voice barely came out above a whisper. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh, holding up her phone. "He did." My heart stopped. The air left my lungs. I reached for the phone, but she pulled it back, her expression filled with disgust. "You were going to let me keep loving him. You were going to let me marry him. Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just hoping I'd never find out?" Tears burned in my eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," she screamed, her voice raw, shaking. "You destroyed everything. You destroyed me." I opened my mouth to speak, to beg for forgiveness, to explain something that had no explanation. But she was already on her feet, already grabbing her keys, already heading for the door. "Please," I started, reaching for her, but she yanked away from me like my touch was poison. "I never want to see you again," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. The door slammed shut, and I was left standing in the wreckage of my own making, watching as my daughter disappeared into the night. And this time, I knew she wasn't coming back. The silence after she left was unbearable. I stood frozen, staring at the door, hoping, praying that she would come back, that she would scream at me again, anything but this emptiness. But she didn't, and as the minutes stretched into hours, I knew she meant it. I tried calling her, no answer. I sent messages that went unread. I sat by the window, waiting for her car to pull back into the driveway, but it never did. I had lost her, maybe forever. The next morning, I forced myself to go to work, to keep moving, to pretend like my world hadn't just crumbled beneath me. But the weight of it sat in my chest, suffocating. I walked through the day in a haze, unable to focus, my mind replaying every mistake, every choice that had led me here. Then, as I was leaving the office, he was there, leaning against his car, waiting, like he always was, like he always would be. I felt my blood turn to ice. I wanted to run, to turn back inside, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but I couldn't. Instead, I walked toward him, each step heavier than the last. "What the hell did you do?" I hissed, my voice sharp, filled with the rage I should have directed at myself long ago. His smirk was infuriating. She was going to find out eventually. I just sped up the process. I clenched my fists, my entire body trembling. "You had no right." He tilted his head, amused. "And you did. You had the right to lie to her, to pretend like none of this ever happened. Come on, don't act like the victim now. We both knew this was going to explode sooner or later." I felt sick, not just from his words, but from the realization that I had been blind to what he really was all along. He had never been scared of getting caught. He had never felt guilty. He enjoyed this, the power, the destruction, the chaos. I took a step back, my breath unsteady. "Stay away from me, stay away from her if you ever come near us again." He laughed low and cold. "What? You'll do what? You think she's ever going to forgive you? You think you can fix this?" I swallowed hard, refusing to let him see the tears burning behind my eyes. "I don't care what you think, I'm done." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. I didn't stop, didn't look back, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had already lost my daughter, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to earn her back. No more lies, no more running. I had destroyed everything. Now it was time to see if anything could be salvaged. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. I had never known time to move so painfully, each hour stretching on like a silent punishment. My daughter was gone. She hadn't come home, hadn't answered my calls, hadn't given me a chance to explain, and maybe she never would. I thought about going to her, showing up at her apartment, begging her to listen. But what would I say? That I was sorry, that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen? Those words meant nothing now. They wouldn't erase what I had done. Instead, I sat in the wreckage I had created, waiting for something that might never come: redemption, forgiveness, a second chance. Then one night I got a message: "We need to talk." It was her. My hands shook as I typed my response, agreeing to meet wherever she wanted. She chose a coffee shop, a neutral space, somewhere she could leave easily if she decided she couldn't stand the sight of me. I couldn't blame her. The next day, I arrived early, my stomach twisted in knots. When she finally walked in, my breath caught. She looked different, older somehow, stronger but also distant, like she had already prepared herself to cut me out of her life forever. She sat across from me, folding her hands on the table, her expression unreadable. "I need to know why." I swallowed hard. "I don't have a good answer." "Try anyway." I took a shaky breath. I was lost, I was unhappy, not with you, never with you, but with myself. I let that make me selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "So that's it, you were unhappy, so you decided to destroy everything? Did you even think about me, about what this would do to me?" My chest ached. I did, but not enough, not when it mattered, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. She looked away, blinking quickly like she was trying to stop herself from crying. "I loved him, and you took that away from me." I felt my own tears rising, but I held them back. This wasn't about my pain, it never had been, I know, and I hate myself for it. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." I nodded, forcing myself to accept the truth. "I don't expect you to, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did, even if that means never seeing you again." Her eyes flickered with something, anger, sadness, something in between. She stood up, and for a moment I thought she was going to leave, but instead she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time." I nodded again, my throat too tight to speak. Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving me sitting there, staring at the empty chair across from me. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a second chance, but it was something. And for now, that had to be enough. The weeks passed, and the ache in my chest became something dull, something I carried with me but no longer let consume me. My daughter hadn't reached out again, and I didn't dare push. She had asked for time, and if that was the only thing I could give her, then I would. I had lost her trust, and I knew it wasn't something I could win back with a few desperate apologies. I had to prove that I was still her mother, that I wasn't just the woman who had shattered her heart. But how do you rebuild something that you burned to the ground? I focused on the small things. I started therapy not because I thought it would fix everything, but because I needed to understand how I had let myself fall so far. I stopped waiting for a call that might never come and instead started writing letters. I never sent them, but each one was filled with the things I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. The regrets, the memories, the love that still remained even after everything I had done. Then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I found an envelope tucked into my mailbox. No name, no return address, just my name written in a familiar hand. My heart pounded as I tore it open. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, but I don't want to hate you either." It wasn't a reconciliation, it wasn't even a conversation, but it was something, a thread, thin and fragile but real. A possibility that maybe one day the door I had slammed shut would crack open just enough to let me in again. I pressed the letter to my chest, closing my eyes as tears burned behind my lids. I had lost so much, and maybe I would never fully get it back. But for the first time since it all fell apart, I had hope. And sometimes, hope is the only thing that keeps us going.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.